7 years ago, my sister and her boyfriend were murdered by her husband after he found out about the affair. He buried them in a shallow grave in the backyard with just a foot of dirt covering the coffin. Sometimes I wonder what Travis thought when he broke the lid and dirt poured in on him. He must have thought they were deep underground and trapped when, in reality, they could have dug themselves out so easily. Michael may have buried them still breathing, but he knew how bad Nat's phobia was. He knew as soon as she woke up, she would go into a panic. There's not a doubt in my mind that he thought she'd end up killing Travis in a blind fright when her claustrophobia set in. I kinda wonder if he originally planned to dig her out when he felt she was sufficiently punished. I guess it's kind of ironic then that Travis strangled her and snapped her neck in that grave. Maybe after Travis killed her, Michael decided to just seal him up. The police are still looking for him. 6 years without even a trace found yet. I have to give it to him. I never expected the doughy prick to be so cunning. Well, I also never suspected he had the spine to murder either, but it's pretty obvious how wrong I was about him now. One of the detectives, Mindy, confessed to me not long ago that they had lost hope in ever finding him without him just blatantly giving himself up. Just extra insult on top of injury at this point. His letter to me started off as only a jump start to my panic. It's what led to the discovery of Natasha and Travis, but it also put a lot of the shittier parts of my life into perspective. To be told so blatantly that I was an awful parent, spouse, and person hurt. It hurt more because all of his points were things I'd already known. Hearing it from an outside source just brought it all home. Since Alicia was born, my marriage had been in decline. In fact, we got pregnant in the first place to save our marriage. Obviously, that didn't work. All Alicia did was put more unnecessary burden on us both. Our relationship had degraded into a sham, and even my goody-goody brother-in-law with his useless dick could see it. As much as I hate to admit it, he was right about how I felt about my daughter, too. Alicia was a strong-willed girl, which clashed with my own personality. I wanted to be able to dress her up in cute, trendy clothes, but all she wanted to wear were dresses that made her look like a creepy doll. The frills and bows and cutesy stuff were fine when she was 4, but at 7, it started to creep me out a bit. She refused to go on walks and hikes with me, didn't want to do anything outdoors. I was an avid camper and hiker and wanted to do those things with her, but she hated anything that involved going into the wilderness. I couldn't even persuade her to go walking on the trail behind the house. That's not to say I didn't love Alicia, but I wasn't close to her either. I could see long years ahead of me full of a weird teenager and eventually a stranger for an adult child who would probably disown me. It always rubbed me a bit raw that she was so close to her father. They loved to go on outings and weekend trips to conventions full of freaks dressed up as video game characters. He filled her closet with those weird doll dresses and bought her costumes from her favorite shows. Adkin indulged her in all her strange pastimes. So did the babysitter. Sadie was into a bunch of the Japanese cartoons that Alicia liked. They would sit for hours together watching the shows in Japanese with subtitles on, and Sadie was even teaching my daughter the other language. I thought it was all ridiculousness, since there wasn't any reason to learn Japanese when she was never going to go there. I'd already started looking into good programs and future careers to get her involved in as soon as she was old enough. I knew something was up when Adkins started taking Sadie with them on trips to those conventions. It wasn't long after that he started claiming to be working late, but coming home smelling like Sadie's fruity body spray. I didn't even bother to mention it for the useless arguments it would cause. I just internalized it that we would eventually divorce due to his infidelity. I'd get the house and Alicia, and he would pay me a bunch in child support, and I'd just relax on the front deck with a mimosa every day. Then my sister was murdered, and my whole life started falling to shit. I had to plan a funeral for my sister while wallowing in a depression so deep I literally couldn't breathe sometimes. I felt like I was drowning most days. More often, I couldn't even get myself out of bed unless it was to sit in the bathtub for hours scalding myself in the hot water. Michael's insults about my hygiene and lack of femininity revolved around my brain on a loop. And despite desperately wanting to shave, do my hair and makeup, get dressed up, clean the house, I just couldn't. I felt too heavy to lift myself. I canceled the yoga class I taught more and more until I quit working entirely. I just couldn't force myself to leave my bedroom. Adkins started having the babysitter stay overnights. He paid her more and more, asking her to start cleaning, doing laundry, driving Alicia to and from school, cooking, etc., while I lay in my room. That little 18-year-old girl stepped into the role of mother and wife while I became nothing. My husband didn't even check in on me anymore. He never came into the bedroom to sleep anymore. The only contact I had was Sadie when she came in to leave food that I rarely ate or clean up my messes. My own daughter didn't even come in anymore. I remember hearing her distant voice from the living room stating she didn't want to go into my room because I smelled bad and it was too dark. It wasn't long before Alicia told me he was moving out. He had gotten himself a nice apartment and he and Sadie were going to live there because she had started school full-time and couldn't work anymore. He wanted to support her while she bettered herself to become some illustrator or something. I don't really remember. I just know he didn't want to be with me anymore. Sadie shared his interests and wore the clothes he liked. She was clean, young, pretty, and made him feel better than I ever had. He had hired someone else to come take care of Alicia and the house, but I was on my own. He wasn't going to make someone take care of me when I wouldn't even take care of myself. I asked him when I should expect divorce papers, and he scoffed at me. He wasn't going to divorce me. He knew that he wouldn't get custody of Alicia with how the court system worked. The child support would eat him alive. It was cheaper for him to pay for the housing and utility costs of 2 households than to get 60% of his income bled out in child support every month. The best approach, in his opinion, was for him and his little slut to get their own place, get someone to take care of Alicia in the house so she could stay in her home, and wait for me to die on my own. He even told me he already had my funeral paid for, so that as soon as I was dead, he could get on with Sadie taking my place. Sounder logic I have never heard. Sarcasm. He came by to see Alicia every few days and called her every night to make sure she was doing well. Without fail, he was there to pick her up on Friday night and dropped her back off Saturday evening. She didn't want for anything. I can't fault him or say he didn't do his fatherly duties. I even understood why he didn't move her into his new place. She had always lived in our house, and the move would be hard on her. It would have been harder than just staying put until I eventually killed myself. The only problem was that I wasn't suicidal. I never have been. I didn't want to die or kill myself. I just didn't want to exist. Life went on in a gray blur for a few months. I don't remember much since everything just bled together into one long, eternal moment. After Adkins' discussion with me, the next thing I remember clearly was when the police came knocking on my door. While officers and detectives tore my house apart, I was briefed on the ridiculous notion that my 8-year-old daughter was a murder suspect. I laughed out loud, laughed in the detective's face, laughed until I was doubled over sobbing. I was delirious and lightheaded. I didn't believe a word they said until I took them to see the security footage of her treehouse and watched with them as recordings of my little girl feeding other kids to a ghost proved me wrong. When I saw her dismember a girl's bitten off arm and blend it up to eat herself, I fainted. In my daughter's treehouse, the police found so much blood, so much hair, tiny bits of bone. I don't know how no one ever noticed it. Well, yeah, I do. I hadn't left my room in 10 months, and her father hadn't been farther into the house than the foyer in at least 6 months. They took her. They tried and sentenced her, all without the public ever being allowed in. Mindy told me it was to keep her reputation clear for when she was released. But I suspect it was more because the evidence was so crazy. They didn't want to have to explain to regular people what the fuck had happened because they weren't even sure themselves. I couldn't even find it within me to blame them. Alicia was sent to a children's mental hospital with a release date for her 18th birthday. She will never be let out, though. We found out not long after her incarceration that there was a tumor in her frontal lobe. She had mentioned it during her interrogation that her ghost friend had said she had a tumor in the front of her head. Imagine the shock when we all learned that she was right. The mass was inoperable, growing, and the prognosis was bleak at best. Alicia's tumor caused her to become extremely violent to anyone and anything near her, and she had to be put in isolation. She was in a tiny, padded isolation cell for 23 hours a day, every day, for many months. Being totally alone and mentally unstable does something to a person so young. She sat on the bed with her back against the wall, staring out into space without any expression. I don't know what she was thinking. She wouldn't speak to anyone. She didn't react to anything. No one knows if it was her mental illness or the out-of-control cells growing in her head. Maybe her state was due to the realization that her ghost was never coming back. Alicia passed away 7 months into her sentence. Adkin moved back in with me after the funeral. Sadie left him when he went into his own descent of depression. She could handle his daughter being a crazed cannibal, but his extreme mourning was too much for her. All his money and connections weren't enough to keep her interest in a 45-year-old man with crippled emotions, a broken wife, and a deceased insane murderer for a daughter. I don't blame her, but I do resent her. A part of me always loved him, even when he was such a horrible person who just wanted me to kill myself. I would have preferred her to step up like an adult and take care of him when he needed it most, instead of dropping him the way she did. He moved back into the house with the explanation that he didn't need his own place without a girlfriend and a daughter. He'd been living in the basement, which is basically a huge studio apartment anyway. Even being in the same house, I never saw him. Usually he was at work or wherever the hell he went when he wasn't home or there. I didn't keep track of his comings and goings. Now, though, I suspect he was at Alicia's grave. Things had faded back to gray when Adkin had his meltdown last Halloween. I don't know why he even wanted to give out candy that night. Maybe it made him feel like less of a failed father. Maybe it made him feel better to see how excited kids were to get the candy. He was drinking when he shot that little boy, but he was definitely not in his right mind before that. Even now, he maintains that he never saw anything but a huge dog barking and jumping at him. Personally, I don't know what I believe. Mostly, I just think the stress finally got to him. He's been in a mental ward of his own after the judge determined him mentally unfit to stand trial. I've never visited him. I never will. Since then, I've had to move into this tiny little studio apartment in the roach-infested and crackhead side of town. I had to sell the house and liquidate literally everything we owned to pay for the legal fees left over from Adkin and Alicia's problems. As much as I'd love to just curl up in bed and not come out again, I now have to work. 6 days a week, I can be found in a sandwich shop a few blocks from my apartment making overpriced footlongs for potheads and meth addicts with 2 teeth in their whole heads. Life is worse now than it's ever been, but I'm still not suicidal. I want to make that really, really abundantly clear. I do not want to kill myself. I don't want to live either, though. That makes my dilemma all the harder. Right now, I'm crossing the street on the way to work. I just stepped out into the crosswalk, and the lights from the bus are blinding. It's holding down on its horn too, so I feel like my eardrums are going to explode. The bus wasn't visible when I stepped out from behind a huge truck parallel parked along the road. The crosswalk light had turned green, and I just started walking because I was already running a little late, and if I didn't get there on time, I was going to be written up again. I guess the bus just didn't have time to stop. My problem is that I have just enough time to get out of the way if I really want to. It may even run over my legs and get me a nice court settlement that would get me out of this ghetto. At the same time, though, all I have to do to end all the bullshit that is my life is to stay right where I am. The massive front wheel of the bus is poised just right to utterly destroy me. I've never thought of how to kill myself because I've never wanted to. But when an opportunity presents itself so perfectly, how can I tell it no?